In Tanzania, today silence has replaced applause. The streets that once echoed with the sound of voters lining up now whisper only fear. Soldiers stand where citizens once celebrated freedom, and behind high military walls in the capital Dodoma, a woman took an oath not before her people, but before her protectors. On Monday, President Samia Suluhu Hassan was sworn in for a second term in what many are calling a coronation behind closed doors. No public gathering, no crowds, no songs of national pride, just a select circle of presidents and generals applauding one another as if nothing had happened. Yet outside those guarded gates, the blood of Tanzanian protesters was still drying on the streets of Dar es Salaam. Officially, she won 97.8% of the vote, a number so absurd it would make even the most hardened dictators blush. In a nation where opposition leaders are in prison and citizens whisper their opinions only in private, this is not democracy. This is Theater 1 in which the outcome was written before the curtain ever rose. And so, the question we must ask is not just about Tanzania, but about Africa itself. When democracy becomes a costume worn by those who fear their own people, what happens to the soul of a continent built on liberation? This is no longer a Tanzanian story. It is the story of a continent betrayed by the institutions meant to protect it. A story of how silence from the African Union and indifference from the international community can bury truth faster than bullets. Stay with us, because what's unfolding in Tanzania may be the warning every African nation has ignored for too long. Please share this video if you believe that truth still matters more than power. Subscribe if you believe Africa deserves leaders who fear injustice more than they fear their own people. When President Samia Suluhu Hassan stepped forward to take her oath in Dodoma, she did so not before a nation, but before a fortress. The ceremony took place behind layers of military cordons, inside a restricted parade ground where even the birds seemed forbidden to fly. Officially, it was called an inauguration. But for millions of Tanzanians watching from their homes, most through shaky VPN connections, it felt more like a coronation without a crown, the formal sealing of a lie. The guest list told its own story. Sitting in the front row were Somalia's Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo, Burundi's Evariste Ndayishimiye, Mozambique's Filipe Nyusi, and Zambia's Hakainde Hichilema. Not a single ordinary Tanzanian citizen was allowed within sight of the stage. The audience was composed of presidents and generals, the same class of men who understand that one day they might need such silence from their own people too. And yet the numbers that brought Samia to that stage defied every law of political gravity. According to the official tally, she received 31.9 million votes out of 37. 7 million registered voters, a staggering 97.8% victory. To put that into perspective, even her late predecessor John Magufuli, accused of manipulating elections in 2020, had claimed only 12.5 million votes. Somehow, in 2025, with opposition leaders jailed, protests erupting, and fear thick in the air, Samia more than doubled that number. These weren't results. They were a declaration of total power. The ruling party Chama cha Mapinduzi CCM ran virtually unopposed. Tanzania's largest opposition party Chadema was banned from the ballot for refusing to sign a government-imposed code of conduct that stripped them of the right to criticize. Its leader was arrested on charges of treason for daring to run for president. Smaller opposition figures faced harassment, surveillance, or exile. Political rallies were banned. News coverage was censored. The few remaining opposition candidates were ghosts, names on paper, not faces on television. And yet the spectacle of control did not end there. At the very moment Samia took the oath, several of those silenced opposition figures appeared in the audience, sitting among foreign dignitaries, clapping politely. Were they coerced, threatened, bought? No one knows. But their presence symbolized what the government wanted the world to see: total submission. The illusion that the nation was united even as it bled. Meanwhile, on the streets of Dar es Salaam, Mwanza, and Arusha, the other half of the story unfolded in brutal contrast. Citizens who refused to accept the 98% verdict poured into the streets, demanding one simple thing: truth. They carried no weapons, only banners and chants echoing through tear gas. Videos later smuggled online showed what happened next: security forces firing directly into crowds, young men collapsing beside women, holding phones instead of stones. By the end of that night, the United Nations reported at least 10 deaths. Opposition leaders claimed the number was closer to 200. The government dismissed those claims as exaggeration, calling the crackdown reasonable and necessary. Reasonable to shoot unarmed citizens, necessary to silence a generation asking for justice. The cruelty wasn't only physical, it was digital. In a move as calculated as it was chilling, Tanzanian police sent a mass text message to citizens' phones. Do not share content that may cause distress or degrade someone's dignity. It was not advice. It was a threat. A reminder that even in their homes, the state was watching. At the same time, internet access was restricted nationwide. Messaging apps slowed to a crawl. Live videos froze midstream. The blackout was not to protect the people. It was to protect the narrative. Because in 2025, a dictator's worst enemy is no longer an opposition party, it's a smartphone. For days, the blackout held. But truth like water finds its cracks. Videos began to reappear through satellite links and VPN's grainy, desperate footage of people chanting bleeding running. And with every image that escaped the legitimacy of Samia's 98% victory bled away one pixel at a time. This was not an election. It was the burial of democracy wrapped in the colors of the national flag. What happened next turned Tanzania's crisis into a continental mirror. The violence in the streets was horrifying enough, but the silence that followed was even more deafening. As the smoke cleared over Dar es Salaam, the African Union AU issued its long-awaited statement. Not a condemnation. Not even a call for investigation. It was a congratulatory message praising President Samia Suluhu Hassan for her peaceful re-election and urging her to continue promoting national unity. For millions of Africans, that single statement said it all. The very institution created to defend the people from tyranny had now become the shield of tyrants. The AU's failure was not new, but this time it was personal. For Tanzanians who had watched their friends shot in broad daylight, for journalists who risked their lives to send a single video out through VPNs, for mothers searching for sons who never came home, this congratulatory letter was like salt in an open wound. The narrator's voice could have paused here, but the story wasn't done. In contrast to the AU's shameful applause, election observers from SADC, the Southern African Development Community, had the courage to tell the truth. Their report stated plainly that in most regions voters could not freely express their will. They cited intimidation arrests and ballot box stuffing. They said what the AU refused to the election was not free, not fair, and not credible. But the AU's word carried more weight in the headlines, and so history began to bend toward the lie. And yet even in darkness, the truth began to find light. Despite the internet shutdown, Tanzanians used every possible tool: satellite phones, encrypted messaging apps, even old radio frequencies to share evidence of what had really happened. From the city of Arusha came footage of soldiers dragging away wounded students. From Mwanza, photos of women shielding children as gunfire crackled nearby. From Dar es Salaam, videos of police vehicles marked with the same slogans of peace and unity that President Samia had just repeated in her speech. Life must continue, she had said at her inauguration. We must protect our values of unity and collaboration. But on the ground, unity had become a synonym for silence. Collaboration meant obedience. The irony was unbearable. Across the continent, reactions began to unfold in two very different worlds. In the first world, the world of power, African leaders saw in Tanzania a blueprint. A perfect script: jail your opponents, ban protests, shut down the internet, and call it democracy. Once the dust settles, the AU will congratulate you and the world will move on. To them, Tanzania was not a tragedy, it was a tutorial. But in the second world, the world of ordinary Africans, the message was terrifyingly clear. If this could happen in Tanzania, a country once hailed as stable and peaceful, then it could happen anywhere. The illusion that at least our democracy works began to crumble. Citizens across Kenya, Uganda, Zambia, and Malawi took to social media saying the same words: if 98% is democracy, then we are all in danger. Even diaspora communities in London, Toronto, and Atlanta organized candlelight vigils, not just for the dead, but for democracy itself. And amid that despair, something unexpected began to happen. Tanzanians refused to disappear. Even with the army patrolling neighborhoods and journalists in hiding, people continued to whisper, to share, to document. Videos appeared with the caption, "We are still here." For a moment, it felt like a movement was being born, not against one president, but against a system that had turned freedom into theater. Meanwhile, the United Nations called for an investigation into alleged human rights abuses. The U.S. State Department expressed deep concern but offered no sanctions. France called for restraint, Britain offered dialogue, and Africa offered silence. It was that silence that became the loudest sound in this story. Because for the first time, Africans were watching not a coup or a rebellion, but a democracy implode in real time while their leaders applauded. And in that moment, the people realized something deeper than fear: they were on their own. What happens to a nation when truth itself becomes a crime? In Tanzania, that question is no longer rhetorical, it's reality. Since the election, daily life has taken on an eerie stillness. Streets, once alive with commerce and laughter, now lie empty, patrolled by soldiers in armored trucks. Markets close early, schools operate under watch, and in Dar es Salaam, government employees have been ordered to work from home, not because of a pandemic or infrastructure failure, but because the regime fears gatherings of any kind. This is what democracy looks like in Tanzania today: silence disguised as peace. The government insists everything is normal. Ministers appear on television smiling as they praise unity and progress. State media shows the president planting trees, visiting hospitals, handing out food parcels. But beneath the choreography of calm, a nation trembles. Families whisper their fears in darkened rooms. Parents tell their children not to repeat what they hear at home. Taxi drivers keep their radios low. The collective memory of violence still hangs in the air like humidity after a storm. For civil society, the consequences have been catastrophic. Human rights organizations have been raided. Activists are missing. Journalists have fled to Kenya or Uganda. Local NGOs that once monitored elections have been deregistered for undermining national stability. Lawyers who dared to represent protesters now face investigations for aiding subversion. The legal system itself has become a weapon, a pen sharpened into a blade. But repression never erases truth. It only drives it underground. Across Tanzania, quiet networks of teachers, students, and church leaders are documenting testimonies from victims. Some collect them on hidden USB drives, others record voice notes that are smuggled abroad. Their work is dangerous but essential: the preservation of memory in a nation being forced to forget. And then there's the economic cost. Tourism, once a major lifeline, has plummeted. Investors nervous about unrest are holding back. Inflation has climbed. Even the wealthy elite, those who once toasted the government's stability, now keep their passports close. Because when a government rules by fear, no one truly feels safe, not even those who enforce its rule. Politically, President Samia's overwhelming mandate has paradoxically weakened her. A 98% victory offers no legitimacy, it only exposes fragility. She cannot travel freely without heavy security. She cannot appear in public without staging the crowd. Every speech must be rehearsed, every camera angle approved. Power built on fear must constantly be maintained by fear. Yet amid the repression, something deeper has shifted in Tanzania's social fabric. People are beginning to lose faith not only in their government, but in the entire concept of democracy itself. In bars and markets, the phrase "maybe we need the army" is no longer taboo. Citizens whisper that perhaps only the military can clean up what politicians have destroyed. It's a dangerous sentiment, but an understandable one. When ballots no longer matter, when protests bring death, and when institutions meant to protect the people instead protect their oppressors, what choices remain? This is how democracies die, not with coups or explosions, but with exhaustion. With citizens who no longer believe that voting changes anything. And this loss of faith is the true wound of Tanzania's crisis. Because once a people give up on democracy, the idea of freedom itself begins to fade. And when that happens, rebuilding trust becomes harder than rebuilding cities. In the aftermath of this election, Tanzania stands at a crossroads. The roads are quiet, but beneath that silence, something is stirring, a mixture of grief, anger, and awakening. The government may have won the battle for power, but it is losing the battle for legitimacy. And once legitimacy is gone, no army, no propaganda, and no 98% victory can ever bring it back. From Washington to Brussels, the reactions to Tanzania's election followed a familiar script: condemnation without consequence. Within days of the results, the U.S. State Department issued a carefully worded statement: "We are deeply concerned by reports of violence and urge all parties to exercise restraint." The European Union echoed the same refrain, calling for dialogue and peace. But as Tanzanian security forces continued to patrol the streets and citizens continued to disappear, the money kept flowing: aid packages, military training, infrastructure loans, all in the name of stability. To many Africans, this hypocrisy is no longer surprising. It is expected, because for the West, stability has always mattered more than freedom. As long as Tanzania remains a partner in counterterrorism, as long as foreign companies retain access to its minerals and ports, democracy becomes optional. It's a quiet, transactional complicity. The same nations that preach transparency and human rights at global summits are the first to shake hands with leaders who silence their citizens. Behind closed doors, diplomats speak of strategic patience. But to Tanzanians, burying their dead patients is just another word for abandonment. The irony cuts deep for those old enough to remember the rhetoric of the Cold War, the endless talk about freedom versus tyranny. Back then, the United States prided itself on being the voice of the voiceless. Yet today, when African citizens rise against digital dictatorships, Washington's silence echoes louder than any speech. And perhaps that's why voices from the global south are beginning to diverge. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traore speaks not of Western-style democracy, but of sovereignty, a model rooted in service, transparency, and dignity, rather than imported systems. While Western leaders debate statements, Traore builds schools, restores farmland, and nationalizes stolen resources. His message to Africa is simple: legitimacy does not come from elections alone. It comes from justice. That contrast is becoming impossible to ignore. As Tanzania sinks deeper into repression, citizens across Africa are asking whether their future lies in imitation or innovation. Must democracy always be Western, or can Africa redefine it on its own terms? For the United States, Tanzania poses an uncomfortable question. How long can America claim moral leadership while partnering with governments that destroy democracy in plain sight? Older Americans watching this may recall a time when the U.S. stood with ordinary people fighting for freedom in Berlin, in Seoul, in Pretoria. The world still remembers that America. But the world also sees the new one: cautious, calculating, unwilling to risk a trade deal for a principle. Meanwhile, in Africa, a new generation is drawing its own conclusions. They see the West's inaction as proof that liberation will not be imported, it must be built. They look not to Washington or Paris, but to Ouagadougou and Bamako, where leaders like Ibrahim Traore and Assimi Goïta are forging partnerships based on self-reliance, not dependency. This is not an anti-Western revolution, it is a moral reckoning. Tanzania's crisis has revealed the uncomfortable truth: the global order that claims to protect democracy often protects dictatorships that serve its interests. And unless the world begins to choose principle over profit, we will keep watching the same movie play out: different countries, same silence, same blood. Tanzania today is not an isolated tragedy. It is a mirror held up to the entire African continent, a reflection of how democracy, once the hope of a generation, is slowly being suffocated beneath the velvet glove of power. On the surface, flags still wave, anthems still play, and elections still take place. But behind those symbols lies a darker truth: a continent where ballots are scripted, oppositions erased, and victory becomes a performance rather than a choice. President Samia Suluhu Hassan may believe she has secured her position through her so-called 98% mandate, but in doing so, she has exposed the emptiness of it all. Because power without legitimacy is not stability, it is paralysis, it is fear, it is the sound of a government barricading itself against its own people. And as Africa watches, one thing becomes clear: this crisis is not just Tanzania's burden to bear, it is a warning. A warning that unless Africans themselves reclaim the meaning of democracy, others will continue to define it for them. The African Union has already shown where it stands, applauding tyrants and condemning courage. But the African people can still choose differently. Across the continent, from Nairobi to Accra, from Bamako to Ouagadougou, a quiet reckoning is underway. The old political order is crumbling and a new one is emerging, one that measures leadership not by the number of votes counted, but by the lives uplifted. That is why the example of Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso resonates so deeply today. He has shown that sovereignty, when built on justice, can restore dignity. That democracy, when grounded in action, can still be reborn. And so we return to the question that began this story. When democracy becomes a costume worn by those who fear their own people, what happens to the soul of a continent built on liberation? The answer depends on all of us, on journalists who still tell the truth, on citizens who refuse to be silent, and on those watching from afar, who understand that silence is not neutrality, it is complicity. If Tanzania's crisis teaches us anything, it is this: democracy dies when people stop caring, when outrage becomes fatigue, and when injustice becomes background noise. Africa deserves better, and so does the world. Please share this message if you believe that democracy must mean more than fear. Subscribe if you still believe that truth is the highest form of patriotism in Africa, in America, and everywhere freedom is under fire.